I mean, everything they do, they do for money. They care nothing about the poison, the people, the lives they're destroying, the misery they're dealing in. That doesn't bother them in one bit.
On a quiet stretch of Texas highway, what looked like a routine traffic stop detonated into something far larger. State troopers pulled over a semi-truck at a truck stop that had operated for years without suspicion. The trailer was sealed, the paperwork was clean, the manifest listed electronics. Nothing triggered immediate alarm, until the doors opened. Beneath legitimate freight sat hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine and fentanyl, compressed, concealed, and distributed with enough volume to poison multiple American cities. Within minutes, the driver was face down on the asphalt in handcuffs. But for federal authorities, the arrest was not the story. It was the breach. That single trailer exposed the front edge of something massive. Phone extractions began immediately. Financial transfers were flagged. Shipping logs were cross-checked against federal databases. Analysts inside the FBI and DEA were already escalating the case before the truck even left the scene under tow. According to law enforcement briefings later reported by U.S. media, the seizure cracked open a $2.8 billion cartel distribution structure embedded directly inside America's transportation system. This was not an isolated courier, not a failed delivery. Investigators traced movement patterns across 47 truck stops in 18 states, nodes positioned along the country's busiest interstate arteries: Interstate 10, Interstate 35, Interstate 40, Interstate 80. Highways that move the American economy were quietly doubling as transfer corridors. Every location looked ordinary. Fuel pumps, diners, parking lots filled with long-haul rigs, publicly registered businesses operating in plain sight. Yet together they formed one of the most sophisticated narcotics pipelines ever identified on U.S. soil. After the Texas seizure, agents focused on the driver inside the cab, Robert Chen, a long-haul operator with no major criminal history. Years behind the wheel, thousands of legitimate miles logged. To anyone looking from the outside, he was indistinguishable from the millions of drivers who move America's freight daily. And that was the strategy. More than 70% of U.S. freight travels by truck. Consumer goods, food supply, medical equipment, industrial materials, an endless stream of lawful commerce flowing through a network so vast that scrutiny becomes statistically thin. The scale itself becomes camouflage. Under questioning, Chen did not describe a desperate side job. He described structure, scheduled routes, timed handoffs, designated rest stops, payment channels routed through layered accounts. When he hesitated to continue running loads, he described pressure from recruiters, language that sounded less like street crime and more like corporate logistics management. That admission shifted the investigation instantly. This was no rogue driver, freelancing shipments. This was operational design. Financial analysts began tracing bank transfers tied to shell entities. Ownership filings revealed overlapping investors. Driver logs matched recurring stops at the same properties across multiple states. The pattern wasn't chaotic. It was organized, controlled, scaled. What stunned investigators was not only the volume of narcotics, but the discipline of the infrastructure behind it. The distribution model mirrored Fortune 500 supply chains: load optimization, route efficiency, staggered delivery timing, compartmentalized roles. On paper, it resembled legitimate enterprise logistics. In reality, the cargo was lethal. As mapping software lit up with connection points, a darker question surfaced. If Chen was only one driver in a rotating schedule, how many others were still moving undetected? The FBI expanded the probe beyond Texas. Data fusion centers began correlating shipping manifests with suspicious corporate registrations. Truck stops across the interstate grid showed unusual ownership similarities. LLCs formed within months of each other, shared financial controllers, synchronized expansion patterns. This was not scattered criminal opportunism. It was a coordinated lattice stretching from the southern border corridors through the Midwest and into major coastal distribution hubs. 47 truck stops, 18 states, billions in projected flow, none hidden, all operating under business licenses. Fuel was pumped, meals were served, trucks rolled in and out without disruption. And inside that routine movement, a cartel logistics system was quietly threading narcotics through the bloodstream of the American highway system. And Texas was only the point where the curtain slipped. The scale of the operation was staggering precisely because nothing about it looked extraordinary. On paper, each location was a standard interstate travel hub: fuel pumps, showers, diners, parking rows lined with long-haul rigs. By daylight, these truck stops functioned exactly As expected along America's busiest freight corridors, drivers refueled, travelers grabbed coffee, receipts were printed, miles were logged, everything was legitimate. That was the shield. Positioned along critical cross-country routes, the 47 locations blended seamlessly into the rhythm of daily commerce. Freight rolled through, tourists passed under neon signs, delivery schedules remained uninterrupted. There were no visible anomalies, no obvious red flags, no perimeter fences, no armed guards. But when night settled and the parking lots thinned, the system shifted. Federal investigators determined that after peak business hours, when most independent drivers had either departed or shut down for mandated rest periods, select trailers were repositioned. Seals were manipulated with precision, compartments were accessed, loads were quietly transferred between trucks. No dramatic exchanges, no visible convoys, just incremental movement, unlike traditional trafficking models that rely on massive warehouses or single bulk shipments. This network operated on disciplined fragmentation. Shipments were broken down into smaller segments. Each transfer looked mundane. Each leg appeared routine. Each load fell beneath the thresholds that typically trigger deeper scrutiny. Individually, nothing looked significant. Collectively, it was enormous. The infrastructure required no hidden desert compounds, no secret docks, no abandoned industrial sites. It relied entirely on the existing backbone of the American freight system. DOT numbers were valid, tax filings were submitted, employees were paid, licenses were active, sales reports matched expected volumes for high-traffic interstate stops. From the outside, these were compliant businesses. Inside, they were synchronized nodes in a multi-billion-dollar narcotics pipeline. For federal investigators, the realization was destabilizing. The assumption had been that criminal infrastructure would exist in the margins, isolated, irregular, structurally flawed. Instead, this network was embedded in the mainstream economy. It did not hide from commerce, it hid inside it. By the time analysts mapped shipment timelines across all 47 stops, the pattern became undeniable. This was not decentralized opportunism, it was coordination. And one question refused to disappear. If billions in narcotics were moving across 18 states, why were there so few long-distance trafficking arrests tied to a single driver? Wiretaps, seized ledgers, and communication logs, later summarized by the U.S. Department of Justice and reported by Reuters, revealed the answer. The system was engineered to prevent visibility, even under failure conditions. No driver was ever permitted to move a full coast-to-coast load. That was policy. Every shipment was divided into controlled segments. One driver handled several hundred miles. At a predetermined stop, the trailer, or part of its contents, shifted to another truck. That driver moved the next leg, then another. A relay model. No single individual saw the full supply chain. No one held the entire route. No one could describe the origin and the destination in the same statement. To law enforcement databases, each trip resembled standard freight movement, normal distances, normal rest patterns, normal route deviations caused by traffic or weather, nothing that independently justified escalation. But layered together, the pattern formed a hidden conveyor belt stretching across America's interstate grid. It was a system built on compartmentalization, plausible deniability, and scale. A driver could be arrested and the structure would not collapse. A shipment could be seized and the pipeline would continue. The loss of one segment did not expose the architecture. It protected it. This was not chaos. It was design. And by the time federal agencies understood that they were not chasing trucks, but mapping a synchronized logistics organism, the investigation had already expanded beyond narcotics. Because any network capable of moving this volume, this quietly, across this many states, was not just exploiting infrastructure, it had mastered it. The process repeated with mechanical precision. A trailer would roll in carrying what appeared to be legitimate freight. Inside hidden compartments or disguised packaging, narcotics were embedded within ordinary cargo. The transfer was fast, controlled, silent, no theatrics, no chaos. The drugs were removed and shifted into another trailer already staged nearby, hooked to a different tractor, driven by someone who believed they were starting a routine assignment, not inheriting a criminal route. According to federal investigators cited by Reuters, this architecture allowed narcotics to move thousands of miles without triggering the behavioral patterns typically associated with trafficking organizations. There were no long-haul anomalies, no cross-country drivers with suspicious mileage, no single vehicle, crossing multiple enforcement zones with a consistent illicit signature. The system didn't just move product, it neutralized risk. If a driver was stopped and arrested, the failure appeared isolated. There was no comprehensive route map in their possession, no direct access to higher command, no documented link to a national network. Each arrest resembled a standalone offense, another individual caught with contraband, disconnected from a larger machine. And that illusion held for years. Millions of trucks move across American highways every day. Inspections are selective by necessity. Volume itself becomes camouflage. Within that statistical noise, the cartel's segmented relay system dissolved into the background. Federal analysts eventually recognized what they were looking at, and the recognition was deeply unsettling. This was not improvisation. It was strategic design. The structure mirrored principles studied in military logistics: segmentation to prevent single point, failure, distributed nodes to protect core command, compartmentalization to preserve operational integrity under pressure. Armies protect supply chains by breaking them into secured segments. If one segment collapses, the campaign continues. This cartel built a civilian analog of that doctrine, using licensed truck stops as transfer nodes, using legitimate freight corridors as supply routes, using compliant paperwork as shielding. DOJ officials later confirmed that the operational discipline rivaled that of established shipping corporations: scheduled rotations, controlled redundancies, layered oversight, accountability without exposure, efficiency without traceability. And what made it even more resilient was ignorance. Drivers knew only their assigned leg. Truck stop managers coordinated handoffs but did not oversee national flow. Financial handlers moved funds through structured transfers without ever seeing physical product. According to court filings referenced in national aid reporting, no single arrest, no matter how public, could dismantle the architecture. Only when federal agencies synchronized data across state lines did the pattern solidify. Once financial records, GPS logs, fuel receipts, and wiretap intelligence were layered together, the network stopped looking like coincidence. It looked like doctrine. At that point, the FBI was no longer reacting to trafficking incidents. They were confronting a logistics-driven cartel treating interstates as supply corridors and truck stops as forward operating bases. The narcotics were not racing across the country in dramatic convoys. They were advancing in disciplined increments, measured, invisible, protected by design. And that forced the most dangerous question of all. If every driver saw only a fragment and every stop managed only a transfer, then somewhere above the fragmentation, someone was seeing the full board. Someone held the map, because systems do not coordinate themselves. As the investigation widened, federal agents began identifying another critical layer. Not steel trailers, not hidden compartments, but people. Behind every short haul was a driver, and many were not career criminals. Court records and reporting summarized by Reuters indicated that recruitment often targeted vulnerability. Drivers who had lost contracts, operators drowning in equipment loans, individuals burdened by medical debt, divorce settlements, or mounting personal obligations. Long-haul trucking is capital-intensive and unstable. When revenue collapses, options narrow quickly. Recruiters approached quietly, through intermediaries, casual conversations at stops, referral chains inside the industry. The pitch was calibrated: one short run, sealed load, no questions, immediate cash. It did not feel like crime at first. It felt like survival. The first few trips were uneventful, a few hundred miles, standard freight documentation, no law enforcement stops, no alarms. Payments arrived, exactly as promised: clean, fast, dependable. Then the leverage began. Drivers who hesitated encountered a change in tone. Questions were discouraged. Requests for clarification were deflected. Once money had been accepted, once routes had been run, once names were logged inside controlled communication chains, walking away became complicated. The network did not rely solely on intimidation. It relied on entanglement. And by the time many drivers understood the scale of what they had entered, they were already a recorded part of it, which meant the silence was not accidental. It was engineered. The money remained. But money was no longer the primary control mechanism. Investigators later confirmed that once drivers were financially entangled, the leverage shifted. The pattern mirrored coercion tactics long documented in cartel operations across the Americas. Conversations became more specific. Home addresses were mentioned casually, family members referenced by name. Children's aid, schools described in unsettling detail. At that point, participation stopped being optional. Some drivers later admitted to completing more than 40 segmented runs over multiple years, each leg small, Each transfer ordinary, each payment clean. No dramatic escalation, just repetition. No one at the truck stops asked questions. Dispatch instructions arrived through encrypted messaging platforms or disposable devices. Routes were delivered in fragments. Every assignment looked like legitimate freight work. Because no single driver ever crossed the country with a full load, none of them felt like they were carrying the weight of a national operation. They were isolated, compartmentalized, controlled. According to DOJ statements cited in national reporting, the structure allowed cartel leadership to enforce discipline while keeping every participant replaceable. If a driver faltered, another could take their segment within hours. The architecture absorbed loss without destabilizing the pipeline. What emerged was not a loose network of opportunistic smugglers. It resembled a coerced labor system embedded inside lawful commerce. From a federal law enforcement standpoint, that distinction changed the case. This was no longer simply narcotics distribution. It was the systematic exploitation of economic vulnerability, leveraging debt, unstable contracts, and fragmented labor conditions to build a controllable transport workforce. The highways did not change. Freight volumes did not change. DOT filings remained consistent. Fuel purchases appeared normal. Only the cargo shifted, and that normalcy delayed detection for years. But as disturbing as the driver coercion was, investigators soon realized it represented only one visible layer. Financial records, wiretap transcripts, and seized communications exposed a deeper compromise. Truck stop managers adjusted docking schedules to align with coded arrival times. Bookkeepers structured transactions to avoid scrutiny. Independent contractors overlooked discrepancies in manifests. Some chose not to see irregularities, others actively facilitated them. According to congressional briefings later reported by Reuters, the infiltration did not stop at the steering wheel. It reached into management. That discovery forced a darker conclusion. The cartel had not merely exploited transportation routes. It had begun embedding itself inside legitimate business structures. Everyday operational roles were being quietly bent into logistical support functions for narcotics distribution. Trust was not shattered publicly. It was eroded silently. If drivers were the pressure point, management was the stabilizer. And above management, there had to be coordination. Because decentralized fear does not produce synchronized efficiency without command. Once investigators pushed beyond individual drivers and began dissecting ownership structures, communication hierarchies, and financial layering, the investigation entered a far more volatile phase. Court-authorized wiretaps began capturing conversations that did not sound like desperate smugglers improvising. They sounded like executives monitoring performance. According to Department of Justice filings later cited in national media, what agents uncovered at this stage fundamentally altered their understanding of the operation. They were no longer looking at infiltration. They were looking at integration. And that meant somewhere inside the system, someone was not just moving shipments, someone was directing them. By the time investigators penetrated the management layer, the illusion of passive neglect collapsed. Many truck stop managers were not ignoring suspicious movement. They were directing it. Phone calls that sounded like routine scheduling, adjusting delivery windows, confirming arrivals, shifting parking assignments, revealed a coded operational rhythm when analyzed in context. Loads were delayed with purpose. Arrivals were staggered. Routes were quietly altered to reduce exposure rather than increase efficiency. This was not negligence, it was command. What appeared to be everyday business coordination was in reality a distributed control structure operating under the cover of lawful commerce. Managers tracked shipment flow with the discipline of professional logistics firms. Volumes were logged, delays were corrected, drivers were rotated strategically. Federal prosecutors later stated that certain locations processed thousands of kilograms of narcotics per week. Steady, disciplined movement across the interstate system without crossing a single international checkpoint. No ports, no customs inspections, no border seizures. Once inside the country, the product flowed along highways engineered for economic speed, not interdiction. The sophistication stunned investigators. Seized records revealed dual-layer documentation. Handwritten notebooks paired with encrypted spreadsheets. Coded annotations mirrored the tracking systems of national shipping companies. Route selections along Interstates 10, 40, and 80 were chosen not just for geographic reach, but for traffic density, where volume itself diluted scrutiny. Truck stops were no longer passive locations. They were fixed operational nodes. Drivers rotated through. Managers remained. Even when arrests occurred, replacement personnel filled gaps quickly. Redundancy was embedded into every layer. No single disruption slowed the pipeline. As agents assembled the architecture piece by piece, the conclusion became unavoidable. This was not an external criminal enterprise exploiting infrastructure from the outside. It was infrastructure being repurposed from within. Legally registered businesses, licensed, taxed, publicly operating, had been converted into logistical bases for organized narcotics distribution. Fuel pumps, parking bays, shower facilities, dispatch desks, all became camouflage. Reuters later reported that federal officials described the case as one of the clearest demonstrations of cartel integration into the American economic framework rather than operation at its margins. That realization forced escalation. Analysts briefed federal leadership in Washington with consolidated data, billions in projected street value, tens of thousands of segmented shipments, a network engineered to absorb arrests without systemic failure. Traditional enforcement would not work. Targeting one location at a time would trigger defensive adaptation. The network would compartmentalize further. Communication chains would fragment. Evidence would disappear. This structure would not collapse under pressure. It would survive it. The strategic conclusion was stark. The network could only be neutralized through simultaneous paralysis. Every critical node had to be struck at once. Every transfer point frozen before information could cascade through encrypted channels. Anything less would allow the organism to shed compromised limbs and continue functioning. Approval followed. According to later DOJ statements, coordinated operational orders were issued across multiple federal agencies, including the FBI, DEA, and state-level partners. The investigative phase shifted into execution planning. Timelines were synchronized down to the minute. Warrants were sealed. Tactical units were assigned to dozens of properties across multiple states. Surveillance teams confirmed presence patterns. Communication intercept teams monitored for early warning signals. The objective was no longer disruption. It was system shock. Each truck stop tied to the network would be hit simultaneously before a single call, message, or alert could ripple outward. What followed was not a gradual sweep. It was a synchronized strike. From Texas through the Midwest and beyond, federal and state teams moved in parallel, designed not to chip away at the structure, but to collapse it in one decisive motion. Because once embedded at this depth, there is only one way to stop the flow. You freeze the entire grid at once.